You've watched colleagues with half your talent get promoted while your brilliant ideas fall on deaf ears in every meeting. Every presentation you give feels like shouting into the void, while others effortlessly command attention and respect. With seemingly simple words, I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent my entire life discovering why some people naturally draw others to them, while equally capable individuals remain invisible and unheard. What I learned from teaching over 750,000 people will transform you into someone others genuinely want to listen to, follow, and support. The influence principles I'll share aren't manipulation tactics, they're authentic ways to connect with human nature so naturally that people will seek your guidance and value your opinion. Whether you're leading a team, building relationships, or simply wanting to be heard, these time-tested methods will make you magnetically influential. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of natural influence. I want to take you back to a moment that changed everything for me, standing in front of my first adult education class in 1912, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold my notes. You see, I wasn't born with the gift of influence. In fact, I was the most unlikely candidate you could imagine. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, I was painfully shy, awkward, and terrified of speaking to anyone outside my immediate family. When I moved to New York City with nothing but $24 in my pocket and dreams bigger than my courage, I discovered something devastating. My fear of people was sabotaging every opportunity that came my way. My first job selling correspondence courses for a ranch in Wyoming was a disaster. I'd walk up to a potential customer's door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it, and inevitably stumble through my presentation like a nervous schoolboy. I failed miserably because I was so focused on what I wanted to say that I never learned what they wanted to hear. But then something extraordinary happened. The YMCA in New York asked me to teach a public speaking course for adults. I was desperate for the money. They were offering $2 per evening, but I had no idea how to teach something I was terrible at myself. That's when I made a discovery that would shape everything. Instead of teaching people how to speak, I decided to help them find their confidence to speak. I'll never forget my first student, a man named Mr. Jackson, who ran a small bakery. He was even more terrified than I was, shaking like a leaf as he stood to share his story about immigrating from Ireland. But when he talked about the bread recipes his grandmother taught him, something magical happened. His fear melted away. His voice became strong and clear, and every person in that room was captivated. In that moment, I realized that people don't need to be taught how to influence. They need to be helped to become authentically themselves. That revelation changed my entire approach. Instead of trying to mold people into some artificial version of a confident speaker, I began helping them discover their own natural magnetism. I watched quiet accountants become dynamic when discussing their passion for numbers. I saw timid secretaries transform into compelling leaders when talking about their families. The secret wasn't in changing who they was in helping them express who they truly were with confidence and genuine care for others. This became the foundation of everything I would later teach. True influence doesn't come from techniques or manipulation. It flows naturally when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to understand them. When you shift from asking, "How can I get what I want?" to "How can I help others get what they want?" everything changes. People sense authenticity, and they're drawn to it like flowers turning toward the sun. Over the years, as my classes grew from a handful of nervous adults to thousands of eager students across the country, I kept refining this simple truth. The most influential people aren't those who talk the most or have the loudest voices. They're the ones who make others feel heard, valued, and important. They understand that every human being carries within them an invisible sign that reads, "Make me feel important." And they honor that sign in every interaction. That scared farm boy who could barely speak to strangers became someone who taught presidents, business leaders, and millions of ordinary people how to connect with others naturally. But the real transformation wasn't in learning to speak it, was in learning to truly see and value the people I was speaking with. Asterisk. The turning point in my understanding of human nature came during a particularly challenging evening class in 1914. I had a student, let me call him Robert, who seemed determined to resist every suggestion I made. No matter what technique I taught, no matter how gently I encouraged him, he would cross his arms, shake his head, and declare that public speaking simply wasn't for him. For weeks I tried everything I knew. I used logic, explaining the career benefits of confident communication. I shared success stories of other students. I even attempted what I thought was motivation, pointing out areas where he could improve. Nothing worked. In fact, the harder I pushed, the more stubborn he became. I was baffled and frankly frustrated. Then one evening, something shifted my entire perspective. Robert arrived late to class, visibly upset. Instead of jumping into the lesson, I asked him if everything was all right. For the first time since he'd joined the class, his defensive walls came down. He told me about his job at a textile factory, where his supervisor constantly criticized his ideas in front of other workers. He spoke about feeling invisible, unimportant, like his thoughts and opinions didn't matter to anyone. As I listened, I began to understand something profound about human resistance. Robert wasn't resisting my teaching because he didn't want to improve. He was resisting because every previous experience had taught him that when someone tried to help him, it usually meant pointing out his flaws and making him feel smaller than he already felt. That night, I had what I can only describe as a revelation about the deepest human need. Every person, regardless of their status or confidence level, carries within them a fundamental hunger to feel important, to feel valued, to feel like they matter. When someone tries to influence us in a way that makes us feel criticized, judged, or diminished, we instinctively resist, not because we don't want to change, but because we're protecting our sense of worth. I realized that most people approach influence entirely backwards. They focus on what they want the other person to do, rather than how they want the other person to feel. They lead with criticism, correction, or commands, completely unaware that they're triggering the very resistance they're trying to overcome. Think about the last time someone tried to change your mind about something important to you. If they started by telling you what you were doing wrong, how did that feel? Did it make you more open to their ideas, or did it make you want to dig in your heels and defend your position even more strongly? I began studying this pattern everywhere I looked. I watched managers struggle with employees who seemed difficult or stubborn. I observed parents battling with children who wouldn't listen. I saw salespeople frustrated with customers who wouldn't buy. In every case, the person trying to exert influence was unknowingly making the other person feel unimportant, criticized, or defensive. But here's what fascinated me most. When I started experimenting with the opposite approach, when I began every interaction by finding ways to make the other person feel genuinely important and valued, resistance melted away like ice in sunshine. People didn't just become more willing to listen, they actively sought my opinion and guidance. I remember the night I applied this insight with Robert. Instead of focusing on what he needed to improve, I spent time discovering what he already did well. I learned that he had incredible insights about machinery and had actually invented a small improvement to his factory's equipment. When I asked him to share that story with the class, something magical happened. His voice became strong and confident, his posture straightened, and for the first time, he looked like a natural leader. The other students were captivated, not because I had transformed Robert through some speaking technique, but because I had helped him feel important enough to share the brilliance that was already within him. From that night forward, Robert became one of my most enthusiastic students, not because I had changed him, but because I had helped him remember his own worth. This became the cornerstone of everything I would teach. Before you can influence anyone, you must first make them feel important, not through empty flattery or manipulation, but through genuine recognition of their inherent value as a human being. When people feel truly seen and valued, they naturally become more open, more collaborative, and more willing to consider new ideas. I learned the devastating cost of making someone feel unimportant during my early days as a traveling salesman. I'll never forget walking into the office of a potential client in Chicago, a successful businessman named Mr. Patterson, who owned a chain of hardware stores. I was young, eager, and convinced that my product was exactly what he needed, without even taking time to learn about his business or his challenges. I launched into my prepared presentation. I told him what was wrong with his current system, pointed out inefficiencies I'd noticed in just 5 minutes of observation, and confidently explained how my solution would fix everything. I was so focused on demonstrating my expertise that I completely missed the growing coldness in his eyes. When I finished my pitch, Mr. Patterson looked at me with a mixture of irritation and disappointment. "Young man," he said, "I've been successfully running this business for 15 years. I've built it from a single store to 7 locations, supporting dozens of families. Do you really think you can walk in here, spend 5 minutes, and tell me everything I'm doing wrong?" I left that office without a sale and with a lesson burned into my memory. When you make someone feel small, criticized, or unimportant, you don't just lose their business, you lose their respect and any chance of future influence. That failure taught me to completely reverse my approach. Instead of looking for what was wrong, I began training myself to look for what was right. Instead of leading with criticism, I started leading with appreciation. Instead of trying to impress people with my knowledge, I became genuinely curious about theirs. The transformation in my results was immediate and dramatic. When I returned to Mr. Patterson's office 6 months later, this time to genuinely learn about his business, rather than sell him something, he spent 2 hours sharing the story of how he'd built his empire. He talked about the innovations he'd implemented, the challenges he'd overcome, and the pride he took in treating his employees well. By the end of our conversation, he was asking me how my product could help him serve his customers even better. This experience taught me that making someone feel important isn't about flattery or manipulation. It's about genuine recognition of their accomplishments, their wisdom, and their value. Every person you meet has done something worthy of admiration, has overcome some challenge that deserves recognition, or possesses some knowledge that merits respect. I began collecting what I called appreciation opportunities in every interaction. With a waitress, I might comment on how efficiently she managed her busy section. With a taxi driver, I'd express genuine curiosity about the most interesting passengers he'd met. With a business executive, I'd ask about the challenges of leading in their industry. In every case, I was looking for authentic reasons to help that person feel valued and important. The magic happened not just in their response to me, but in how they began to see themselves. When you consistently help people feel important, you're not just improving your relationship with them, you're actually helping them become more confident, more generous, and more open to growth and change. I remember a young woman in one of my classes named Margaret, who worked as a bookkeeper and was convinced she had nothing interesting to contribute. For weeks, she sat silently while others shared their stories. Then, one evening, I learned she had single-handedly reorganized her company's entire filing system, saving them hundreds of hours of work each month. When I asked her to share that accomplishment with the class, something remarkable happened. Other students began asking her questions about organization and efficiency. Suddenly, this quiet bookkeeper was recognized as an expert, a problem solver, someone whose insights had real value. Her confidence soared, not because I had taught her techniques, but because I had helped her recognize the importance she already possessed. This principle extends far beyond formal teaching or business relationships. In your family, with your friends, in every casual interaction throughout your day, you have countless opportunities to make people feel important. The grocery clerk who helps you find an item, the colleague who stays late to finish a project, the child who tries hard even when they don't succeed. Of these people has an invisible sign around their neck that reads, "Make me feel important." When you learn to see and honor that sign, something profound happens. People don't just like you more, they become more willing to listen to your ideas, more eager to help you achieve your goals, and more open to being influenced by your perspective. They begin to associate you with the feeling of being valued and respected, which is one of the most powerful foundations for lasting influence. But here's the crucial distinction. This must be genuine. People have an almost supernatural ability to detect insincerity. Empty compliments or manipulative flattery will backfire spectacularly. The appreciation must be authentic, specific, and focused on something that genuinely matters to the other person. The most influential people I've ever known share this common trait. They have trained themselves to look for the good in others, and to express that recognition sincerely and specifically. They understand that before you can move someone toward your ideas, you must first help them feel good about themselves. Asterisk, my transformation from a self-centered young man to someone who genuinely cared about others didn't happen overnight. It began with a painful realization during one of my early dinner parties in New York. I had invited several successful business people to my apartment, hoping to impress them and build valuable connections for my career. I spent the entire evening talking about my achievements, my plans, my insights about business and life. I was convinced I was being fascinating and charming. But as the guests left, I overheard one of them say to another, "Well, that was exhausting. He didn't ask me a single question about myself all evening." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I realized that my desperate attempt to seem important had made me completely uninteresting to others. I was so focused on being impressive that I had forgotten to be interested, and in doing so, I had missed every opportunity to create genuine connections. That embarrassing evening forced me to examine my approach to relationships. I discovered that I had been treating every conversation like a performance where I was the star, rather than a genuine exchange between equals. I was more focused on what clever thing I would say next than on actually hearing what others were telling me. I decided to conduct an experiment. For the next month, I would approach every conversation with one simple goal: to learn something interesting about the other person. Instead of preparing stories about myself, I prepared questions about them. Instead of thinking about how to impress them, I focused entirely on understanding them. The results were astounding. People who had previously seemed uninterested in talking to me suddenly became animated and engaging. Conversations that used to feel forced and awkward became natural and flowing. Most surprisingly, people began describing me as one of the most interesting conversationalists they knew, even though I was talking less than ever before. I remember a conversation with a man named Thomas at a business luncheon. In the past, I would have tried to impress him with my knowledge of his industry. Instead, I simply asked him what he enjoyed most about his work. His face lit up as he told me about a new manufacturing process he had developed that reduced waste by 30%. As I asked follow-up questions, not to show off my knowledge, but because I was genuinely curious, he became more and more animated. By the end of our conversation, Thomas was treating me like an old friend. He invited me to tour his factory, introduced me to his business partners, and even asked for my thoughts on a challenge he was facing. all because I had shown genuine interest in something that mattered to him. This experience taught me that most people are starving for someone to take a real interest in their lives, their work, their thoughts, and their experiences. We live in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, but very few people are truly listening. When you become someone who listens not just to respond, but to understand, you become irresistibly attractive to others. I began developing what I called curiosity conversations. Instead of small talk about the weather, I would ask questions like, what's the most interesting project you're working on right now? Or what's something you've learned recently that surprised you? Or what's been the most rewarding part of your week? These questions did something magical. They invited people to share the parts of their lives they were most passionate about. And when someone talks about their passions, their entire energy changes. They become more animated, more confident, more interesting. They begin to associate you with that feeling of being truly heard and understood. But here's the crucial element that separates genuine interest from mere technique. You must actually care about the answers. If you're asking questions just to manipulate someone or to get them to like you, they'll sense the insincerity immediately. People have an almost mystical ability to detect whether your interest is real or whether you're simply going through the motions. True interest means being curious about someone's experiences, challenges, dreams, and perspectives, not because of what they can do for you, but because every person has a unique story worth understanding. When you approach conversations with authentic curiosity, something wonderful happens. You stop being nervous about what to say next, because you're genuinely absorbed in what the other person is sharing. I learned to ask follow-up questions that showed I was really listening. What made you decide to take that approach? Or how did that experience change your perspective? Or what would you do differently if you faced that situation again? These questions demonstrated that I wasn't just waiting for my turn to talk. I was genuinely interested in understanding their thoughts and experiences. The most influential people I've encountered all share this quality. They make others feel like the most interesting person in the room. They have mastered the art of being interested rather than trying to be interesting. They understand that when you give someone your complete attention and genuine curiosity, you're offering them one of the rarest and most valuable gifts in human interaction, the experience of being truly seen and heard. Asterisk. I'll never forget the humiliation I felt at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in 1918 when I was introduced to the mayor of a small town in Pennsylvania. We had a pleasant 5-minute conversation about his city's growth plans. 2 hours later, when I saw him across the room and wanted to continue our discussion, I realized with horror that I had completely forgotten his name. I spent the rest of the evening awkwardly avoiding him, too embarrassed to admit my failure. That night, I went home and made a solemn promise to myself. I would never again let someone feel unimportant because I couldn't remember something as basic as their name. You see, a person's name is, to that person, the sweetest and most important sound in any language. When you remember and use someone's name, you're sending a powerful message. You matter enough for me to remember who you are. When you forget it, you're unconsciously communicating the opposite. You're not important enough for me to make the effort. I began developing a systematic approach to remembering names that served me for the rest of my career. The first step was to truly listen when someone introduced themselves, instead of being distracted by thinking about what I would say next. I learned to repeat the name immediately. Nice to meet you, Mr. Johnson, rather than just nice to meet you. But repetition alone wasn't enough. I discovered that I needed to create mental associations that would make the name stick. If I met someone named Rose, I might picture them surrounded by beautiful roses. If their name was Baker, I'd imagine them in a baker's apron. The more vivid and personal I could make the association, the better it worked. I also started the practice of using a person's name several times during our first conversation, not so often that it seemed forced, but enough to cement it in my memory. "Mr. Wilson, what brought you to tonight's event?" Or, "That's a fascinating perspective, Mrs. Anderson." The results were remarkable. People began responding to me with greater warmth and attention. I noticed that when I used someone's name during a conversation, they would lean in slightly, their eyes would brighten, and they would become more engaged. It was as if I had touched something deep inside them. I remember meeting a young secretary named Helen at a law firm where I was giving a presentation. Most people barely acknowledged her existence, treating her as just part of the office furniture. But I made a point to learn her name and use it whenever I spoke with her. "Good morning, Helen. How has your week been?" Or, "Helen, could you help me understand how the filing system works here?" By the end of my visit, Helen had become one of my strongest advocates in that office. She went out of her way to ensure my presentation went smoothly, introduced me to key people I needed to meet, and even followed up with me weeks later about opportunities in other firms. All because I had taken the time to see her as a person worthy of having her name remembered. This principle became especially powerful in my teaching. In classes of 30 or 40 adults, I made it my goal to learn every single name by the second session. Students were amazed and touched that I cared enough to make this effort. It created an immediate sense of personal connection and respect that made them far more receptive to everything I taught. I developed little tricks to help with this challenge. I would arrive early and greet people individually as they entered, repeating their names and asking questions that helped me remember something unique about each person. I'd create seating charts with notes about each student. Most importantly, I'd use their names frequently during class discussions. "John, what's your experience with this?" Or, "Mary, how do you think this applies to your situation?" But the real magic happened outside of formal settings. I learned that using someone's name in casual encounters with waiters, shop clerks, doormen, or taxi drivers had an almost magical effect. These brief interactions, which most people treat as impersonal transactions, suddenly became human connections. There's something profound that happens when you call a person by name. You're acknowledging their individual identity in a world that often treats people as anonymous faces in a crowd. You're recognizing their humanity and their worth as a unique individual. I discovered that this simple practice, learning and using names, was one of the fastest ways to build influence with anyone. People naturally gravitate toward those who make them feel seen and valued as individuals. And nothing communicates that quite like the sound of their own name spoken with genuine respect and warmth. Asterisk. The most influential conversation of my early career lasted 2 hours, and I spoke for less than 10 minutes of it. I was meeting with a prominent businessman named Charles Schwab, hoping to secure his endorsement for my courses. I had prepared an elaborate presentation about my methods, my results, and why he should support my work. But when I arrived at his office, something told me to take a different approach. Instead of launching into my prepared pitch, I simply asked him, "Mr. Schwab, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what makes some leaders more effective than others." What happened next changed my understanding of influence forever. For the next hour and 50 minutes, Charles Schwab shared his insights about leadership, his experiences building one of America's largest steel companies, and his observations about human nature. I asked occasional questions and made supportive comments, but mostly I just listened with complete attention. At the end of our meeting, Schwab looked at me with genuine warmth and said, "Dale, that was one of the most valuable conversations I've had in months. Of course, I'll endorse your course, as anyone who understands people as well as you do must be an excellent teacher." I walked out of that office with his full support, having barely mentioned my courses at all. The power wasn't in what I had said, it was in how completely I had listened. This experience taught me that most people are desperate to be heard. They're surrounded by individuals who are waiting for their turn to talk, not truly listening to what's being said. When you become someone who listens with your whole being, not just to respond, but to understand, you become incredibly valuable to others. But real listening is far more challenging than most people realize. I had to train myself to overcome my natural tendency to interrupt with my own thoughts and experiences. I learned to resist the urge to immediately offer solutions or advice. Most importantly, I had to silence the voice in my head that was constantly preparing my next comment. I developed what I called listening with 3 ears. The first ear heard the words being spoken. The second ear listened for the emotions behind those words. Was the person excited, frustrated, worried, proud? The third ear listened for what wasn't being said, the underlying concerns or desires they might not be expressing directly. This deeper level of listening transformed my relationships with students, colleagues, and friends. I remember a student named Frank who seemed angry and resistant during his first few classes. Instead of trying to convince him to be more positive, I simply asked him to tell me about his experiences with public speaking. As I listened without judgment, Frank shared a painful story about being humiliated by a teacher in front of his entire high school class. That embarrassment had followed him for years, making him associate speaking up with shame and ridicule. Once I understood his real concern, that he couldn't speak well, but that he was terrified of being humiliated, Agani could address his actual need for safety and respect rather than just pushing him to participate more. Within weeks, Frank became one of my most enthusiastic students, not because I had given him techniques, but because I had given him something even more valuable: the experience of being truly heard and understood. I learned that when people feel genuinely listened to, several remarkable things happen. First, they naturally become more open and honest, sharing deeper thoughts and feelings than they would with someone who's just waiting for their turn to speak. Second, they begin to trust you more quickly, because listening is one of the most generous gifts you can give another person. Third, they become more willing to listen to you. In return, influence becomes mutual rather than one-sided. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that listening helps you understand what people actually want and need, rather than what you think they should want. This understanding is the foundation of all genuine influence. You can't effectively guide someone toward a destination until you understand where they're starting from and where they truly want to go. I began teaching my students specific listening techniques. I showed them how to use their body language to demonstrate attentionally, lean slightly forward, maintaining appropriate eye contact, nodding to show understanding. I taught them the power of reflective listening. It sounds like you're feeling frustrated about ... or what I'm hearing is that you value. But the most important lesson was about the intention behind listening. If you listen only to gather ammunition for your next argument, people will sense that manipulation. If you listen to find weaknesses you can exploit, they'll feel violated. True influential listening comes from genuine curiosity and care about the other person's experience. The paradox I discovered is that the less you try to be heard, the more people want to hear what you have to say. When you consistently demonstrate that you value others' thoughts and feelings, they naturally become more interested in your thoughts and feelings. Listening doesn't diminish your influence, it multiplies it exponentially. I learned one of my most valuable lessons about changing minds during a heated argument with my neighbor in Missouri. We were disputing the property line between our farms, and I was absolutely convinced I was right. I had the surveyor's documents, the legal precedent, and logic on my side. So I presented my case with all the force and conviction I could muster. The result: my neighbor became more entrenched in his position than ever. Our friendly relationship deteriorated into cold hostility, and what should have been a simple resolution turned into a bitter feud that lasted months. I had won the argument on facts, but lost completely in terms of relationship and practical outcome. That painful experience taught me a profound truth. When you start by telling someone they're wrong, you're essentially asking them to admit that their judgment, their intelligence, or their understanding is faulty. No one enjoys making that admission, especially in front of others. Instead of opening their mind to your perspective, you're triggering their ego's defense mechanisms. I began experimenting with a radically different approach. Instead of leading with disagreement, I would start by finding areas where we could agree. Even when someone held a position that seemed completely opposite to mine, I learned to look for the underlying values, concerns, or goals that we might share. The transformation in my results was immediate and dramatic. I remember a particularly challenging situation with a business owner who was adamantly opposed to investing in employee training. In the past, I would have argued about the benefits of education and the short-sightedness of his position. Instead, I began by acknowledging what we both agreed on. "You're absolutely right that you need to be careful with your investment decisions," I said. "And I completely agree that you can't afford to waste money on programs that don't deliver real results. As a business owner myself, I understand that every dollar spent has to contribute to your bottom line." Notice what happened there. I wasn't being manipulative or dishonest. I genuinely did agree with those points. But by starting with agreement, I created a collaborative atmosphere instead of an adversarial one. From that foundation of shared understanding, we could explore together how training might actually serve the goals we both cared about. This approach, which I came to call the Yes Foundation, works because it aligns with a fundamental aspect of human psychology. When people say yes to small points, they become psychologically more inclined to continue agreeing. When they start by saying no, they tend to remain in disagreement mode. I learned to listen carefully for the valid points in any position, even one I fundamentally disagreed with. If someone was against expanding their business, I might say, "You're wise to be cautious about overextending yourself. Growth without proper planning can definitely be dangerous." If someone was resistant to changing a process, I might acknowledge, "You're right that this current system has served you well for years, and change always involves some risk." These weren't empty techniques. They represented a genuine shift in how I approached disagreement. Instead of seeing the other person as an opponent to be defeated, I began seeing them as a partner in solving a mutual problem. Instead of focusing on where they were wrong, I looked for where they were right, wise, or at least understandable in their concerns. The magic happened in what came next. After establishing this foundation of agreement, I could introduce different perspectives without triggering defensive reactions. Given your concern about financial prudence, you might be interested in some data I've seen about the return on investment from training programs, ... Or since we both want your business to thrive long term, let me share an approach that might address your growth concerns while minimizing risk. I discovered that people are far more willing to consider new ideas when they feel their current thinking has been respected and understood. They don't have to abandon their position entirely. They can simply expand it to include additional possibilities. This principle proved invaluable in my teaching. When students resisted certain concepts or exercises, I stopped trying to convince them they were wrong to feel hesitant. Instead, I would say something like, "You're absolutely right to be cautious about trying new approaches. It makes perfect sense that you'd want to stick with methods that feel safe and familiar." From that foundation of understanding, students naturally became more open to exploring why these new approaches might be worth considering. They didn't feel like I was asking them to admit failure or stupidity. I was simply offering additional tools that might serve their already wise desire for effectiveness and safety. The most persuasive conversations I've ever had followed this pattern. Begin with genuine agreement. Acknowledge the wisdom in their current thinking. and then build from that foundation rather than tearing it down. People don't need to be wrong for you to be right. Often, you can both be right from different perspectives. And true influence comes from helping others expand their perspective rather than abandon it. This approach requires patience and genuine respect for others' intelligence and experience. But when you master it, you'll find that people seek out your opinion because they know you'll honor their thinking, even when you see things differently. And that respect creates the trust necessary for real influence to occur. Asterisk, the hardest lesson I ever learned about influence came through one of the most embarrassing moments of my professional life. I was giving a presentation to a group of business leaders in Chicago, confidently sharing what I believed to be a groundbreaking insight about employee motivation. Midway through my talk, one of the attendees politely raised his hand. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "I think you may have misunderstood the study you're referencing. I'm familiar with that research, and the conclusions were actually quite different from what you've described." My face burned with embarrassment. Every instinct screamed at me to defend my position, to argue, to find some way to save face in front of this important audience. But something deeper told me to take a different path. "You're absolutely right," I said, stopping my presentation entirely. "I clearly misremembered the details of that study, and I apologize for the confusion. Would you mind sharing what the research actually found?" The room fell silent. I could feel the shock speakers simply didn't admit mistakes so openly and completely. But what happened next taught me one of the most powerful lessons about influence I've ever learned. The gentleman who had corrected me smiled warmly and spent several minutes explaining the actual findings of the study. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to collaborative. Other attendees began asking questions and sharing their own experiences. Instead of seeing me as an embarrassed lecturer who had made an error, they began treating me as a fellow learner who was genuinely interested in getting to the truth. By the end of that presentation, I had more business inquiries and speaking invitations than from any talk I'd ever given, including ones where I hadn't made any obvious mistakes. The willingness to admit my error hadn't diminished my credibility, it had enhanced it dramatically. This experience forced me to examine a fundamental misconception I'd carried about influence and authority. I had believed that admitting mistakes would make people lose respect for me, that acknowledging errors would undermine my expertise. Instead, I discovered that the opposite was true. People trust and follow those who demonstrate the courage and integrity to own their failures. Think about your own experience. When someone makes a mistake and then tries to cover it up, deny it, or blame others, how do you feel about them? Now compare that to how you feel about someone who quickly acknowledges their error, takes responsibility, and focuses on making things right. Which person seems more trustworthy? Which one would you rather work with or take advice from? I began experimenting with this principle in smaller interactions. When I was wrong about a fact, I would immediately say, "I was mistaken about that. Thank you for the correction." When I handled a situation poorly, I would admit it. "I realize I approached that conversation badly. Let me try again with a better understanding of your concerns." The results were consistently surprising. Instead of losing respect, people began seeing me as more authentic and trustworthy. Instead of viewing my mistakes as signs of incompetence, they saw my willingness to acknowledge them as evidence of integrity and self-awareness. I remember a situation with one of my assistants, Janet, who had made an error in scheduling that caused me to miss an important meeting. My first impulse was to point out her mistake and ensure it didn't happen again. But as I reflected on the situation, I realized that my own unclear instructions had contributed to the confusion. When I spoke with Janet, I began by acknowledging my part in the problem. "I realize I didn't give you clear enough guidelines about how to handle scheduling conflicts. That's my responsibility as your supervisor, and I should have been more specific. Only then did we discuss the importance of double-checking dates and confirming appointments. Janet's response was remarkable. Instead of becoming defensive about her error, she thanked me for the clear guidance and became one of the most reliable assistants I ever worked with. More importantly, our relationship strengthened because she saw that I was willing to take responsibility for my own contributions to problems rather than simply assigning blame. This principle became especially powerful in my teaching. When students pointed out errors in my examples or challenged my conclusions, I learned to respond with genuine gratitude. That's an excellent point. I hadn't considered that perspective, or you're right to question that assumption. Let's explore it together. These moments of acknowledged fallibility didn't weaken my authority as an instructor. They strengthened it. Students began to see me as someone who was genuinely interested in truth and learning rather than in being right all the time. They became more willing to share their own thoughts and questions because they knew I wouldn't respond defensively if they disagreed with me. I discovered that admitting mistakes serves several powerful functions in building influence. First, it demonstrates intellectual honesty, which is the foundation of trust. Second, it shows emotional maturity and self-confidence. Only secure people can acknowledge their errors without feeling diminished. Third, it creates psychological safety for others to admit their own mistakes and uncertainties, which leads to more honest and productive relationships. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that people don't expect perfection from their leaders and mentors. They expect authenticity and the wisdom to learn from errors. When you try to maintain a facade of infallibility, you create distance between yourself and others. When you acknowledge your humanity through honest admission of mistakes, you create connection and trust that becomes the foundation for genuine influence. Asterisk. One of my most stubborn students taught me the difference between commanding and guiding. His name was William, a successful contractor who had built his business through decisive leadership and clear directives. In my class, whenever I suggested a new approach to public speaking, William would cross his arms and explain why it wouldn't work for someone in his position. For weeks, I tried the direct approach. William, you need to practice this technique, or this method will help you if you'll just try it. The more forcefully I insisted, the more resistant he became. Our interactions had devolved into a battle of wills that was helping neither of us. Then one evening, I decided to try something different. Instead of telling William what he should do, I asked him what he thought might work. William, I said, you've been successful in business for 20 years. What do you think has made you effective when you need to persuade clients or employees? His demeanor immediately softened. For the first time, he wasn't being asked to defend against my suggestions. He was being invited to share his expertise. He talked about how he listened to clients' concerns before proposing solutions, how he showed them examples of his work rather than just describing it, and how he always made sure they felt confident in their decision. Those are excellent principles, I responded. How do you think those same approaches might apply to public speaking? What happened next was remarkable. William began connecting his own business wisdom to the speaking principles I had been trying to teach him. He came up with applications and modifications that were actually more sophisticated than what I had originally suggested. By the end of our conversation, he was eager to try these approaches, not because I had convinced him, but because he had convinced himself. This experience taught me a fundamental truth about human psychology. People are far more committed to ideas they help create than to ideas that are imposed upon them. When you tell someone what to do, you're asking them to accept your judgment over their own. When you ask questions that help them reach the conclusion themselves, you're honoring their intelligence and autonomy. I began transforming my entire teaching approach from declarative to interrogative. Instead of saying, "Here's what you should do," I learned to ask, "What do you think might work in this situation?" Instead of "This is the right way to handle conflict," I would inquire, How have you successfully dealt with difficult people? In the past, the change in classroom dynamics was immediate and profound. Students became more engaged because they were actively participating in developing solutions. Rather than passively receiving instructions, they took more ownership of their learning because they were contributing to the insights rather than simply accepting mine. I remember working with a shy accountant named Dorothy who was terrified of presenting financial reports to her company's board of directors. In the past, I might have said, "You need to practice your presentation until you feel confident." Instead, I asked her, "When do you feel most confident in your work?" She told me about how comfortable she felt when clients came to her office for consultations. In that familiar environment, surrounded by her charts and documents, she could explain complex financial concepts with clarity and authority. "What is it about that environment that makes you feel so capable?" I asked, as Dorothy explored her own question. She realized that her confidence came from thorough preparation, familiar surroundings, and having visual aids to support her explanations. From there, it was a natural step for her to apply those same success factors to her board presentations. The beauty of this approach is that people rarely resist their own ideas. When Dorothy decided to bring more visual aids to her presentation and arrive early to familiarize herself with the boardroom, she wasn't following my advice, she was implementing her own insights. This made her far more likely to actually follow through and to adapt the approach when circumstances changed. I learned to craft questions that guided people toward useful discoveries without manipulating them toward predetermined conclusions. Questions like, "What has worked well for you in similar situations?" Or "What would success look like from your perspective?" Or "What concerns do you have about this approach?" These questions honored their experience while helping them think through challenges and opportunities. This principle proved especially valuable when dealing with resistance or disagreement. Instead of arguing with someone's objections, I learned to explore them. "That's an interesting concern. What specifically worries you about that approach?" Or "Help me understand what you think the risks might be." Often, when people were encouraged to fully explore their objections, they would begin to see solutions or realize that their concerns weren't as insurmountable as they had initially thought. But even when their concerns were valid, the process of thorough exploration helped us find better approaches that addressed their real needs. The asking approach also revealed information that telling never could. When I asked people what they thought, what they wanted, or what worried them, I learned about motivations, constraints, and opportunities that I never would have discovered through one-way communication. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that questions demonstrate respect for the other person's intelligence and experience. When you ask someone for their thoughts, you're communicating that you value their perspective and that you believe they have wisdom worth sharing. This respect becomes the foundation for genuine influence, not the kind that comes from authority or manipulation, but the kind that emerges from mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving. I learned the devastating cost of making someone lose face. During my early days as a public speaking instructor, one of my students, a successful banker named Mr. Richardson, had developed a habit of interrupting other students during their presentations. His comments were often insightful, but his timing was disruptive and discourteous. After several weeks of this behavior, I decided to address it directly. In front of the entire class, I said, "Mr. Richardson, you need to control your impulse to interrupt. It's disrespectful to your fellow students and disruptive to the learning environment." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Richardson's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. He gathered his materials and walked out of the classroom, never to return. I had been factually correct about his behavior, but I had handled the situation in the worst possible way by humiliating him in front of his peers. That night, I realized I had committed one of the greatest sins in human relations. I had caused someone to lose face publicly. In trying to correct his behavior, I had attacked his dignity and self-respect. No behavior change is worth destroying someone's sense of self-worth. I spent considerable time reflecting on how I could have handled that situation differently. What if I had spoken with Mr. Richardson privately after class? What if I had found a way to redirect his enthusiasm into more helpful channels? What if I had acknowledged his insights while gently suggesting better timing? This painful lesson taught me to always provide what I came to call golden bridges, graceful ways for people to change their position or behavior without admitting they were wrong or foolish. People need to be able to maintain their dignity and self-respect, even when they're adjusting their approach. I began developing techniques for helping people save face while still achieving necessary changes. When someone needed to alter their behavior, I learned to frame it as evolution rather than correction. Instead of, "You're doing this wrong," I would say, "As you develop more experience with this, you might consider ... I remember working with a student named Elizabeth, who had a tendency to speak too quietly during presentations. Rather than criticizing her volume, I said, "Elizabeth, your content is so valuable that I want to make sure everyone in the room can benefit from your insights. What do you think about projecting your voice a bit more so that people in the back can hear these important points?" This approach allowed Elizabeth to increase her volume without feeling criticized for her previous presentations. She was helping her audience rather than correcting a flaw. The change in her behavior was immediate and lasting because it felt like growth rather than remediation. I learned to offer multiple reasons for change, always including face-saving explanations. When suggesting someone adjusts their approach, I might say, "Given the new circumstances, ... or as your expertise has grown, ... or considering your audience's needs." These phrases allowed people to change without admitting their previous approach was wrong. One of my most challenging situations involved a prominent businessman who had been giving the same presentation for years. His content was outdated, and his delivery style was putting audiences to sleep. But he was proud of that presentation and defensive about any suggestions for change. Rather than pointing out the problems with his current approach, I focused on the opportunities ahead. Given how much your industry has evolved, your audience is probably ready for your updated insights, I suggested. What new developments do you think would be most valuable to share? This framing allowed him to revise his entire presentation, while maintaining the sense that he was enhancing something good rather than fixing something broken. He became enthusiastic about the changes because they represented growth and adaptation rather than admission of failure. I discovered that this principle extends far beyond formal teaching situations. In business negotiations, family discussions, and everyday interactions, people need ways to change their minds or adjust their behavior without losing dignity. When my wife wanted to change our vacation plans, she didn't say my original idea was bad. Instead, she said, "You know, I've been thinking about your suggestion, and I wonder if we might enjoy exploring this other option even more." When a colleague needed to modify his project approach, I didn't criticize his initial plan. I said, "This is a solid foundation. What do you think about building on it in this direction?" The key insight is that people's self-image is often more important to them than being right about any particular issue. When you threaten someone's sense of competence or wisdom, they'll fight to defend their ego even when they know their position isn't optimal. But when you offer them ways to change while preserving their dignity, they often embrace new directions enthusiastically. This requires patience and creativity. It's much faster to simply point out what's wrong and demand correction. But that approach creates resentment and resistance that can last for years. Taking the time to create golden bridges for people to cross gracefully builds loyalty and respect that pays dividends indefinitely. I learned that true influence isn't about winning battles, It's about achieving outcomes while preserving relationships. When you help people save face while making necessary changes, you demonstrate respect for their humanity that goes far beyond the immediate situation. Asterisk. The transformation of Martha Hopkins taught me one of my most powerful lessons about human motivation. Martha was a middle-aged bookkeeper who joined my public speaking class with crippling anxiety about speaking in front of groups. During her first attempt at a presentation, she stood frozen at the front of the room for nearly 30 seconds, before managing to whisper a few barely audible sentences about her work. My instinct was to offer constructive criticism about her volume, posture, and delivery, but something told me to focus elsewhere. Instead of pointing out what needed improvement, I found anything genuinely praiseworthy about her effort. "Martha," I said after her presentation, "I want you to know that your courage in standing up here tonight, despite your obvious nervousness, is truly admirable. And the information you shared about bookkeeping procedures was incredibly clear and well organized. You have valuable knowledge that others need to hear." The change in Martha's expression was immediate. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and, for the first time since joining the class, she made eye contact with me. That tiny spark of recognition that someone had noticed her effort and found value in her contribution became the foundation for one of the most dramatic transformations I've ever witnessed. Over the following weeks, instead of focusing on Martha's weaknesses, I made it my practice to notice and acknowledge every small improvement. When she spoke slightly louder, I commented on how much easier it was to hear her valuable insights. When she maintained better posture, I mentioned how confident she appeared. When she made eye contact with one person in the audience, I praised her connection with her listeners. Each acknowledgement, no matter how small, seemed to fuel Martha's confidence for the next attempt. Within 2 months, this woman who had barely been able to whisper to a small class was delivering engaging presentations to community groups and business organizations. The transformation wasn't the result of criticism or technique, it was the natural outcome of systematic recognition and encouragement. This experience taught me that most people are starving for genuine appreciation, and when they receive it, they naturally want to deserve more of it. Criticism, even when accurate and well-intentioned, tends to discourage further effort, but praise for genuine progress, no matter how small, creates momentum that can lead to extraordinary changes. I began studying this principle more systematically. I noticed that when I pointed out what students were doing wrong, they often became self-conscious and performed worse in subsequent attempts. But when I focused on what they were doing right and acknowledged their improvement, they naturally wanted to build on that success. The key was ensuring that the praise was genuine and specific. Empty compliments like "good job" or "nice work" had little impact. But when I could point to specific evidence of progress, "Your opening story captured everyone's attention immediately," or "the way you used that example made a complex concept perfectly clear," people lit up with pride and motivation. I remember working with a young man named James, who had a severe stuttering problem. Traditional approaches had focused on correcting his speech patterns, which only made him more self-conscious and tense. Instead, I began acknowledging every moment when his speech flowed smoothly, no matter how brief. "James, when you talked about your experience at the factory just now, your words flowed beautifully. Your passion for the subject completely overcame any technical concerns." These moments of recognition helped James associate speaking with success rather than failure, and gradually his confidence and fluency improved dramatically. I learned that this principle applies to all types of behavioral change, not just public speaking. When my assistant was learning to manage my complex schedule, I could have focused on the appointments she missed or the conflicts she created. Instead, I made it a point to notice and acknowledge every scheduling success, every problem she prevented, every improvement in her organizational systems. The result was that she became increasingly committed to excellence, not because she feared criticism, but because she enjoyed the satisfaction of deserving praise. She began taking initiative to improve systems I hadn't even asked her to work on, because she had learned to associate her work with recognition and appreciation. I discovered that praise works best when it follows what I called the progress principle. Instead of praising people for their natural talents or fixed qualities, I learned to acknowledge their effort, their improvement, and their choice to grow. You're naturally gifted is less motivating than the work you've put into developing this skill is really paying off. This approach builds what psychologists now call a growth mindset, the belief that abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. When people believe their efforts lead to improvement, they're more willing to persist through challenges and setbacks. I also learned the importance of acknowledging progress publicly when appropriate. When I praised Martha's improvements in front of the class, other students began to see her differently. This shift in how others perceived her reinforced her own growing confidence and created additional motivation to continue improving. But perhaps the most important insight was that focusing on small steps makes big changes feel achievable. When someone is overwhelmed by the gap between where they are and where they want to be, they often give up before starting. But when they can see and celebrate small improvements along the way, the journey becomes manageable and even enjoyable. The habit of noticing and acknowledging progress transforms not just the people you're trying to influence, but your own perspective as well. Instead of becoming frustrated by how far someone has to go, you begin to appreciate how far they've come. This shift in your own attitude creates a more positive, supportive environment that naturally encourages further growth. Asterisk, the most dramatic example of expectations power came through a young man named Tommy who enrolled in my course after being referred by his employer. Tommy worked as a clerk in a law firm, and his supervisor had made it clear that his job was in jeopardy due to his poor communication skills and lack of confidence. During our first private conversation, Tommy told me he was convinced he was just not cut out for this kind of work. He described himself as naturally shy, not very bright, and destined for mediocre positions. His entire self-image was built around limitation and inadequacy. But as I listened to Tommy talk about his interests outside of work, I heard something different. He spoke passionately about organizing neighborhood baseball games for local children, describing how he coordinated schedules, resolved conflicts between parents, and motivated kids who were struggling with the game. Without realizing it, he was demonstrating exactly the leadership and communication abilities his employer claimed he lacked. Instead of accepting Tommy's self-assessment, I decided to help him see what I could see. Tommy, I said, based on what you've just told me about organizing those baseball games, you're already demonstrating remarkable leadership skills. You're coordinating complex schedules, managing diverse personalities, and inspiring young people to develop their potential. Those are exactly the abilities that make great professionals. The look of surprise on Tommy's face was unforgettable. No one had ever described him as having leadership abilities or professional potential. But I wasn't flattering him, I was pointing out evidence of capabilities he already possessed but had never recognized in himself. Over the following weeks, I consistently spoke to Tommy as if he were the capable, intelligent professional I could see he had the potential to become. When he shared ideas in class, I treated them with the same respect I showed to more senior students. When he made presentations, I highlighted the strengths that demonstrated his natural abilities rather than focusing on areas needing improvement. More importantly, I began giving Tommy responsibilities that reflected my confidence in his capabilities. I asked him to help newer students with their presentations, to coordinate small group discussions, and to share his insights about overcoming nervousness. Each of these assignments was designed to reinforce the identity I was helping him develop. The transformation was remarkable. Within 3 months, Tommy was speaking with confidence, contributing valuable ideas in class discussions, and carrying himself with an entirely different energy. His supervisor at the law firm began noticing improvements in his work performance and communication with clients. But the most significant change was in how Tommy saw himself. This experience taught me that people have an almost irresistible tendency to live up to the expectations others hold. For them, particularly when those expectations are expressed by someone they respect. When you consistently treat someone as capable, intelligent, and valuable, they begin to see themselves that way and naturally start behaving accordingly. I learned to be very intentional about the expectations I communicated, both verbally and through my actions. Instead of saying, "I hope you'll be able to handle this," I would say, "I know you'll handle this well." Instead of "try your best," I would say, "I'm confident you'll find a great solution." These subtle differences in language communicated radically different levels of expectation and confidence. But the expectations had to be genuine and realistic. People can sense when confidence is manufactured or when expectations are set artificially high. The key was finding the zone where expectations were challenging enough to inspire growth, but realistic enough to be achievable with effort and commitment. I remember working with a woman named Carol who had convinced herself she was terrible at organizing information. Her presentations were indeed disorganized and hard to follow, but instead of focusing on her current limitations, I looked for evidence of her organizational potential. I noticed that Carol's questions during class discussions were always insightful and well-structured. When she talked informally about her work experiences, her stories were clear and logically sequenced. I began pointing out these examples. "Carol, the way you just explained that situation was perfectly organized. You gave us the context, the challenge, and the outcome in exactly the right sequence." By consistently highlighting evidence of her organizational abilities in informal settings, I helped Carol begin to see herself as someone who could organize information effectively. This shift in self-perception naturally transferred to her formal presentations, which improved dramatically as she began to trust her natural organizational instincts. I discovered that building reputation through expectation works because it helps people access capabilities they already possess but may not recognize or trust. Most people are far more capable than they believe themselves to be, but limiting beliefs and past negative experiences create mental barriers that prevent them from demonstrating their full potential. When you express genuine confidence in someone's abilities, you're not creating skills they don't have, you're creating an environment where their existing skills can emerge and develop. You're giving them permission to be more than they thought they could be. This principle proved especially powerful with people who had been labeled as problem employees or difficult students. Often, these individuals had simply internalized negative expectations from previous experiences. When I treated them as capable, intelligent people who were simply facing temporary challenges, they often exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. The responsibility that comes with this power is significant. When you express confidence in someone, they will often go to extraordinary lengths to prove that confidence was justified. This creates an obligation to set expectations that serve their growth and development, not just your immediate needs. I discovered the secret of making people happy to help you during a crisis in my own business. I needed to expand my teaching schedule to meet growing demand, but this meant asking my existing instructors to take on additional evening classes, requests that would significantly impact their personal time and family commitments. My first impulse was to simply explain the business necessity and hope they would accept the additional workload out of loyalty. But I realized this approach would likely create reluctant compliance rather than enthusiastic cooperation. Instead, I decided to understand what would make this opportunity genuinely appealing to each instructor. I spent individual time with each team member, not to make my request, but to learn about their personal goals and interests. I discovered that Robert wanted to develop expertise in training business executives. Sarah was passionate about helping women build confidence in professional settings. Michael was interested in exploring how public speaking principles could help people in sales careers. Armed with this understanding, I was able to frame the additional classes not as burdens to bear, but as opportunities to pursue their individual interests. Robert's extra classes would focus on executive communication skills. Sarah would develop and lead a special series for professional women. Michael would create a program specifically for sales professionals. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Instead of reluctantly accepting additional work, my instructors became excited about opportunities to develop expertise in areas they were passionate about. They approached their new responsibilities with energy and creativity that enhanced both their own professional development and the quality of our programs. This experience taught me that people are naturally motivated when they can see clear connections between what you want them to do and what they want to achieve. The key is taking time to understand their individual motivations, values, and aspirations, and showing how your request can serve their interests as well as your own. I began applying this principle systematically in all my interactions. When asking students to practice speaking exercises, I learned to connect the activity to their personal goals. For the businessmen concerned about board presentations, I would frame practice as preparation for career advancement. For the mother wanting to be more effective in community volunteer work, the same exercise became preparation for inspiring others toward important causes. The difference in response was remarkable. Instead of seeing exercises as assignments to complete, students began viewing them as opportunities to develop capabilities they genuinely wanted. This shift in perspective led to higher quality practice, more enthusiastic participation, and better results. I remember working with a student named David who was extremely resistant to participating in class discussions. He would attend faithfully, but rarely spoke unless directly called upon, and then only grudgingly. Traditional approaches, encouragement, explanation of benefits, even gentle pressure had failed to increase his participation. Then I learned that David was passionate about woodworking and had developed innovative techniques for furniture construction. Instead of pushing him to participate in general discussions, I began asking for his insights on topics where his woodworking experience was relevant: precision in craftsmanship, attention to detail, problem solving when projects didn't go as planned. Suddenly, David became one of the most engaged participants in class. He would eagerly share examples from his workshop that illustrated speaking principles, and his contributions were so valuable that other students began asking him for advice. He wasn't just participating to please me, he was sharing knowledge he was proud of with people who appreciated his expertise. I learned that effective motivation requires understanding what psychologists call intrinsic motivators, the internal drivers that make people genuinely want to engage in activities. These might include the desire for mastery, the need for autonomy, the satisfaction of meaningful contribution, or the pleasure of creative expression. When I could connect my requests to these deeper motivators, compliance transformed into enthusiasm. People didn't just do what I asked. They brought creativity, energy, and excellence to the task because it served their own psychological needs. This approach worked especially well when dealing with resistance or reluctance. Instead of trying to overcome objections through pressure or persuasion, I would explore what might make the person genuinely want to participate. Often, resistance disappeared when people could see how an activity would serve their own interests or values. I discovered that this principle applies to all types of influence situations. In families, The parent who can show children how household responsibilities contribute to their own sense of capability and family belonging will get better cooperation than one who relies on rules and consequences. In business, the manager who can connect job responsibilities to employees' professional development goals will inspire higher performance than one who focuses only on company needs. The key insight is that people don't resist doing things they want to do. When you can genuinely connect your requests to their wants, needs, and values, resistance disappears and enthusiasm emerges. But this requires genuine interest in their perspective and willingness to adjust your approach to serve their interests, as well as your own. This isn't manipulation, it's enlightened self-interest. When you help others get what they want in the process of getting what you want, you create win-win situations that build loyalty, trust, and long-term cooperation. People become happy to help you because helping you helps them achieve their own goals. The most successful influence I've ever exercised has come not from convincing people to do things they didn't want to do, but from finding ways to make them genuinely want to do what needed to be done. The power of vivid presentation became crystal clear during one of my most challenging classes. I was trying to help a group of executives understand the importance of employee recognition, but my logical arguments and statistical evidence were met with polite nods and obvious disinterest. These were busy, practical people who had heard countless theories about management. They needed something more compelling than abstract concepts. Then I remembered a story from my own experience that illustrated the principle perfectly. Instead of continuing with my theoretical explanation, I told them about Mrs. Henderson, an elderly cleaning woman at a hotel where I had stayed. I described how Mrs. Henderson transformed my entire week through small acts of thoughtful service. Fresh flowers in my room, remembering that I preferred extra pillows, taking pride in making my stay comfortable. But the real impact came when I took time to thank her personally and tell her supervisor how exceptional her service had been. The change in Mrs. Henderson was immediate and dramatic. She stood taller, smiled brighter, and began taking even more pride in her work. Other hotel staff noticed her renewed energy and began asking what had changed. By the end of my stay, the entire floor's service had improved because one person felt genuinely appreciated as I told this story. I watched the executives' expressions change from polite attention to genuine engagement. They could picture Mrs. Henderson, imagine her feelings, and understand viscerally how recognition had transformed both her performance and the entire work environment. The abstract concept of employee recognition had become a real, relatable human experience. This moment taught me that people don't think in abstract principles, they think in concrete images, stories, and experiences. When you want to influence someone's thinking or behavior, you must make your ideas vivid enough to capture their imagination and create emotional connection. I began studying how to make every important concept come alive through what I called theatrical presentation. This didn't mean being dramatic or artificial, it meant using all available tools to make ideas memorable, engaging, and personally relevant. Stories became my primary vehicle for this. Instead of explaining that honesty builds trust, I would tell about the time a salesman admitted he didn't have the best product for my needs and recommended a competitor's solution. That honesty led to a relationship that resulted in thousands of dollars of future business when I did need what he offered. Visual demonstrations proved equally powerful. When teaching about the importance of first impressions, I would have two people enter the room, one dressed professionally with confident posture, another slouched and poorly groomed. The contrast made the concept immediately obvious in ways that lectures about professional appearance never could. I learned to use props and visual aids to make abstract concepts tangible. When discussing the compound effect of small improvements, I would show how a penny doubled daily becomes over $5 million in a month. When explaining the power of persistence, I would bring a Chinese bamboo seed and explain how it shows no growth for 5 years, then shoots up 90 feet in 6 weeks, all because of the root system developed during those seemingly unproductive years. Physical involvement enhanced learning even further. Instead of just talking about confident body language, I would have students practice standing, sitting, and moving with confidence. They could feel the difference in their own bodies, which made the concept much more real and actionable than any description could achieve. I discovered that emotional engagement was crucial for lasting impact. Facts inform, but emotions motivate. When I wanted students to understand the cost of poor communication, I wouldn't just cite business statistics. I would tell the story of a father who never learned to express love to his children, and how those words remained unspoken until it was too late. The most effective presentations became mini-dramas, where abstract concepts played out through real human experiences. When teaching about the power of sincere interest in others, I would describe my conversation with a lonely taxi driver who lit up when I asked about his family, his work, and his dreams. Students could feel the driver's isolation and his joy at being truly heard. I learned that contrast and comparison made ideas more vivid. Instead of just explaining good listening skills, I would demonstrate poor listening, interrupting, looking distracted, giving advice instead of understanding. The contrast made good listening techniques immediately obvious and memorable. Metaphors and analogies became powerful tools for making complex ideas accessible. When explaining influence, I would compare it to gardening. You prepare the soil, plant seeds carefully, provide proper conditions, and patiently nurture growth rather than trying to force immediate results. The key was ensuring that every vivid element served the learning objective rather than becoming mere entertainment. The stories, demonstrations, and visual aids had to illuminate the principle being taught, not overshadow it. The goal was memorability in service of understanding and application. I noticed that when ideas were presented vividly, students would often reference the stories and examples months later. The accountant who learned confidence still talked about standing like Mrs. Henderson after receiving recognition. The executive who learned about employee motivation would refer to planting seeds like a gardener when describing his management approach. This theatrical approach to influence works because the human brain is designed to remember stories, images, and experiences far better than abstract concepts. When you can attach your ideas to vivid, memorable presentations, you dramatically increase the likelihood that people will remember, understand, and act on what you've shared. Asterisk, the most unmotivated student I ever encountered taught me the surprising power of noble challenge. His name was Frank Sullivan, a middle-aged insurance salesman who had been ordered by his company to attend my course after months of declining performance. Frank made his resentment clear from the first day, slouching in his chair, arriving late, and participating only when directly forced to do so. All my usual techniques failed with Frank. Encouragement fell flat. Recognition of his strengths was met with skepticism. Even connecting the material to his personal goals couldn't penetrate his wall of resistance. After 3 weeks, I was ready to suggest he withdraw from the course rather than continue disrupting the learning environment for others. Then something unexpected happened. During a class discussion about overcoming sales objections, Frank made a dismissive comment about how real selling was different from classroom theory. Instead of becoming defensive or trying to correct him, I saw an opportunity. "Frank," I said, "you're absolutely right that there's a difference between theory and practice. In fact, I'd like to challenge you to prove something. You have more real-world sales experience than anyone in this room. I challenge you to take the principles we're discussing and show us how they actually work in the field, or prove that they don't." Something shifted in Frank's expression. For the first time since joining the class, He seemed genuinely interested. The challenge appealed to his professional pride and his desire to prove his expertise. More importantly, it positioned him as the expert rather than the student. Over the following weeks, Frank began approaching the course material differently. Instead of resisting the concepts, he started testing them against his experience and adapting them to his specific situations. He began sharing examples from his work not to show off, but to explore how the principles played out in real sales conversations. The transformation was remarkable. Frank became one of the most engaged participants in the class, but more importantly, his sales performance began improving dramatically. By positioning the course content as a challenge to his expertise, rather than instruction for his deficiencies, I had tapped into his natural competitive drive and professional pride. This experience taught me that most people have an innate desire to prove themselves capable of meeting worthy challenges. When you can frame your requests or suggestions as challenges rather than instructions, you often trigger deep motivational drives that external pressure cannot access. I began experimenting with what I called challenge framing in various situations. Instead of telling a shy student she needed to speak louder, I would challenge her to ensure that her important message reached every person in the room. Instead of criticizing a disorganized presenter, I would challenge him to create a presentation so clear that even a complete newcomer could follow his logic perfectly. The response was consistently positive. People who resisted direct instruction would embrace the same suggestions when they were framed as challenges to their capabilities. The difference was that challenges appealed to their strength and competence, while instructions implied weakness and inadequacy. I discovered that the most effective challenges had several key characteristics. First, they had to be worthy of the person's effort, meaningful enough to engage their pride and ambition. Second, they had to be achievable with genuine effort, neither too easy nor impossibly difficult. Third, they had to connect to something. The person already valued their professional reputation, their desire to help others, or their personal growth. Competition, when properly structured, became another powerful motivational tool. But I learned to focus on what I called noble competition challenges that elevated everyone involved rather than creating winners and losers. I remember organizing a presentation contest where students competed not to be the best speaker, but to deliver the most helpful information to their audience. This shift in focus meant that everyone was working toward the same goal, serving others, rather than defeating each other. The competitive energy remained, but it was channeled toward excellence rather than domination. Another effective approach was creating team challenges where groups competed to achieve collective goals. When I challenged different sections of a large class to demonstrate the best application of a particular principle, each group pushed themselves harder than they would have individually. But their success didn't come at the expense of others. I learned that people often perform far beyond their normal capabilities when they're inspired by a worthy challenge. The businessman who claimed he could never speak, without notes, delivered a passionate 15-minute presentation from memory, when challenged to prove that his message was important enough to come from his heart. The timid secretary who barely whispered in normal conversation projected her voice powerfully when challenged to ensure her valuable insights reached everyone in the room. The key was making the challenge about becoming more of who they already were, rather than becoming someone different. Frank Sullivan didn't become a different kind of salesman. He became a better version of the salesman he already was. The shy student didn't become an extrovert. She became more effective at sharing her naturally thoughtful insights. This principle proved especially powerful with people who had been labeled as difficult or unmotivated. Often, these individuals simply hadn't been given challenges worthy of their capabilities. When you can identify what they take pride in and challenge them to demonstrate that excellence, Resistance often transforms into enthusiastic effort. The most lasting influence I've ever achieved has come not from telling people what they should do, but from challenging them to become the best version of who they already are. Asterisk. As I reflect on how these principles of natural influence apply to your modern world, I'm struck by both what has changed and what remains eternal about human nature. The tools of communication have evolved dramatically. You now connect through emails, video calls, social media, and digital platforms I could never have imagined. But the fundamental human needs for importance, understanding, and genuine connection remain exactly the same. In fact, I believe these timeless principles are more crucial now than ever. In a world where people are constantly bombarded with information and competing for attention, the person who can make others feel truly seen, heard, and valued has an extraordinary advantage. While others are shouting louder to be noticed, you can influence more effectively by listening more carefully and responding more thoughtfully. Consider how the principle of making others feel important applies to your digital communications. In an email, you can acknowledge someone's expertise, given your experience with project management. I'd value your thoughts on this approach. In a video call, you can demonstrate genuine interest by asking follow-up questions about their ideas rather than immediately jumping to your own agenda. The art of remembering names becomes even more powerful in virtual environments where people often feel anonymous or disconnected. Starting a video conference by greeting participants by name, referencing previous conversations, or acknowledging their contributions creates immediate personal connection in what might otherwise feel like impersonal digital interaction. Listening may be more challenging but also more impactful in your modern context. With so many distractions competing for attention during virtual meetings, the person who gives complete, focused attention stands out dramatically. When you resist the temptation to multitask during video calls and instead practice listening with 3 ears, you create the same powerful connection that worked in my face-to-face classes. The principle of finding agreement before introducing differences becomes crucial in our polarized times. Whether you're navigating workplace disagreements, family discussions, or community conflicts, starting with shared values and common ground creates the foundation for productive dialogue. We both want this project to succeed, or I can see we both care deeply about this issue opens doors that confrontational approaches slam shut. Social media and digital platforms offer unprecedented opportunities to apply the principle of genuine interest in others. Instead of using these tools primarily to broadcast your own thoughts and achievements, you can use them to learn about others' experiences, celebrate their successes, and ask thoughtful questions about their insights. The person who consistently engages with others' content in meaningful ways builds influence that transcends any single platform. The challenge and competition principle adapts beautifully to modern team environments, whether remote or instead of creating artificial pressure through threats or demands. Effective modern leaders frame projects as meaningful challenges. I'm curious to see how we can use this new technology to serve our customers even better, or what if we could solve this problem in a way that becomes a model for other teams. Even the principle of helping others save face becomes more important in digital environments where mistakes and conflicts can be preserved and shared instantly. When someone needs to change their position or correct an error, offering face-saving explanations becomes an act of both kindness and strategic wisdom, given the new information that's become available, or as the situation has evolved, The modern workplace's emphasis on remote collaboration makes the skill of asking rather than telling even more valuable. When you can't rely on physical presence and direct supervision, your ability to guide people toward insights through thoughtful questions becomes essential. What obstacles do you anticipate? Or how do you think we might address that concern? creates buy-in and ownership that commands never could. I'm particularly fascinated by how the principle of making ideas vivid applies to your digital age. While you have access to powerful presentation tools, videos, and interactive media, the core need remains the same. People remember and act on ideas that capture their imagination and create emotional connection. The story about Mrs. Henderson would be just as powerful delivered through video as it was in my classroom. Perhaps most importantly, I believe your modern world creates an even greater hunger for authentic human connection. While technology enables more efficient communication, it can also create isolation and superficial interaction. The person who brings genuine warmth, sincere interest, and authentic appreciation to their relationships, whether digital or in person, satisfies a deep need that technology alone cannot address. The principles I've shared aren't techniques to manipulate or tricks to get your way. They're expressions of fundamental respect for human dignity and recognition of our universal need to feel valued and understood. In your fast-paced, highly connected but often impersonal world, these principles offer a way to create meaningful relationships that enrich both your life and the lives of others. Your challenge is not to learn new principles of influence, but to apply these timeless truths consistently in whatever context you find yourself. Whether you're leading a virtual team, building a business, strengthening family relationships, or contributing to your community, these principles will serve you as well as they served me and the hundreds of thousands of students I was privileged to teach. The technology may change, but the human heart remains constant, and it is to that heart, the universal desire to feel important, understood, and valued, that all true influence must ultimately appeal. Asterisk, as I near the end of my time with you, I want to share what I consider the most important insight from my lifetime of studying human nature and influence. The ultimate purpose of influence is not to get what you want, but to help others become the best version of themselves. Every person you encounter carries within them unrealized potential talents. They haven't discovered confidence, they haven't developed contributions they haven't made. When you use the principles I've shared with genuine care for others' growth and well-being, you become a catalyst for bringing out that hidden potential. I think of all the students whose lives were transformed, not because I taught them techniques, but because I helped them see and develop capabilities they already possessed. Martha Hopkins didn't become a different person. She became the confident, capable person she had always been underneath her fear. Tommy Sullivan didn't acquire new talents. He learned to recognize and trust the leadership abilities he had demonstrated in other areas of his life. This is the true power and responsibility of natural influence. You have the ability to help others see themselves more accurately and completely. In a world that often focuses on people's limitations and shortcomings, you can be the voice that acknowledges their strengths and possibilities. But with this power comes profound responsibility. Every interaction you have with another person either builds them up or tears them down, helps them grow or keeps them small, increases their confidence or diminishes it. The way you listen to someone, the way you respond to their ideas, the way you acknowledge their contributions, all of these seemingly small moments shape how they see themselves and what they believe they're capable of achieving. I challenge you to use these principles not as tools for personal advancement, but as expressions of service to others. When you make someone feel important, you're not just improving your relationship with them, you're contributing to their sense of self-worth. When you listen to someone with genuine interest, you're not just gathering information, you're giving them the rare gift of feeling truly heard and understood. The ripple effects of this approach extend far beyond your immediate relationships. When you help someone feel more confident and capable, they naturally treat others with greater respect and kindness. When you demonstrate genuine interest in someone's thoughts and experiences, they become more curious about others. When you acknowledge someone's contributions, they become more generous in recognizing others' efforts. This is how real change happens in the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through countless daily interactions where people are treated with dignity, respect, and genuine care. Every time you apply these principles authentically, you're contributing to a more positive, collaborative, and humane world. Your legacy will not be measured by the positions you attain or the recognition you receive, but by the number of people who became better versions of themselves because they encountered you. It will be reflected in the confidence you helped someone discover, the talents you helped someone develop, the contributions you helped someone make. I encourage you to see every person you meet as carrying an invisible sign that reads not just, "Make me feel important," but "Help me become who I'm meant to be." Approach each interaction with curiosity about what gifts this person possesses, what challenges they're facing, and how you might contribute to their growth and success. Remember that influence is not something you do to people, it's something you do with them and for them. The most sustainable and satisfying influence comes from helping others achieve their goals, realize their potential, and contribute their unique value to the world. The principles I've shared with you have been tested across decades and cultures, in classrooms and boardrooms, with struggling students and successful executives. They work because they honor the fundamental dignity and potential that exists in every human being. But knowing these principles is not enough. Your challenge now is to practice them consistently, patiently, and authentically until they become natural expressions of who you are rather than techniques you apply. Start with small interactions, the grocery clerk, the colleague, the family member, and gradually expand your practice to more significant relationships and situations. Be patient with yourself as you develop these skills. Like any worthwhile ability, natural influence requires practice, reflection, and continuous refinement. There will be times when you forget to listen, when you slip into old habits of criticism or impatience, when you focus more on being heard than on understanding others. These moments are not failures, they're opportunities to learn and grow. Most importantly, remember that true influence begins with genuine care for others' well-being and success. When your heart is in the right place, when you sincerely want to help others flourish, the techniques become natural expressions of that care, rather than manipulative tools for personal gain. The world needs more people who understand and practice these principles, people who can bring out the best in others, who can build bridges instead of walls, who can create collaboration instead of conflict. You have the opportunity to be one of those people. Go forth and use these principles to make every person you encounter feel a little more important, a little more understood, a little more capable of achieving their dreams. In doing so, you'll discover that helping others realize their potential is the most rewarding and influential thing you can do with your life.